Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The CIA began as a spy agency after World War II, when it became clear that new threats like the Soviet Union required a more robust intelligence gathering operation. But it didn't stop there. Soon the CIA was planning and executing military operations without proper congressional oversight and transparency. That continues through to today, as presidents of both parties have turned to the CIA to handle missions far away from public view. Joining me to discuss this is William Blum, a former State Department official, an author and historian. He is the author of America's Deadliest Export: Democracy, the Truth About U.S. Foreign Policy and Everything Else, as well as Killing Hope, a history of U.S. military and CIA interventions since World War II. Welcome to the program, William Blum.
Hi.
Well, first, let's get into the history of the CIA and how it was that the blurring of lines between an intelligence gathering agency and a military agency began. What happened in U.S. history to sort of expand the CIA's scope beyond simply intelligence gathering?
Well, following the end of the Second World War, there was a worldwide rising expectations movement. Former colonies all over were revolting against their former masters, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and France, and so on. And these rising expectations and these revolts soon became movements for socialism or communism. And that rang certain bells back at CIA headquarters. And the U.S. was committed, or self-committed, to intervening in each of these places to suppress each of these attempts at revolution.
Now, what are the main supporters of the CIA, or who are the main supporters, I should say, of the CIA? Is the CIA an agency that is perhaps too close to institutions in our government, such as the Pentagon, such as the White House? Does the CIA need to be a more insulated agency in order to stay truer to its original mission?
Well, I'm speaking in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and that means the U.S. government. To make a fine distinction between the CIA and the Pentagon and the White House or the State Department, for example, misses the point. It's the U.S. government which is dedicated to world hegemony. They want to dominate the world. That's pure and simple.
And so in that sense, then, is the CIA a sort of convenient tool for U.S. foreign policy?
Well, it's more than just a tool. It's a major force in U.S. foreign policy, along with the military and the State Department.
So explain how the CIA sort of works in conjunction with other national security agencies, and whether that collaboration also feeds into this blurring of lines between military versus intelligence gathering.
Well, the CIA does whatever is needed in each case, whether it's espionage or guerrilla warfare or overthrowing governments. Those actions are all part of U.S. foreign policy, and they vary from nation to nation. I have compiled a list of, since the Second World War, of more than 50 governments the U.S. has attempted to overthrow. It's a remarkable record.
Now, in many ways, then, do you see the CIA as a way in which the United States can secretly undermine international law, treaties that it is a party to, things that essentially it doesn't want to be seen as doing overtly are enabled covertly by the CIA?
Yes, that's one of its major functions. There have been countless occasions since the end of the Second World War where the CIA has overthrown governments or suppressed movements for social change, and they've hidden their movements enough so that the White House, when they're questioned about this, can deny that the U.S. was involved. Now, this process has gone a step further by the creation of NGOs. The best example of this is the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED. that was created in the early 1980s, and it's been involved in the suppression of movements or overthrow of governments all over the world for decades now, all while posing as a private organization, although it's fully funded by Congress. So there's no question that it's a government organization, and yet it passes itself off as a private organization, and that makes it much more acceptable to people all over the world.
Now, William, let's turn back to the CIA and its actions, particularly in the years since the 9/11 attacks. President Obama and the White House seems to have become quite allied with the CIA, particularly over the White House's refusal to release the Senate Intelligence's report on CIA practices that many see as being tantamount to torture. And I'm wondering if you sort of see the CIA's biggest supporters in the White House on things like that.
Well, there's no question that the U.S. use of torture, which was very widespread for years and years, and still is being done, that is a very sensitive topic with the White House and with the State Department. And they are always looking for ways to cover up American involvement in torture.
So the CIA has also been notorious in working with groups that would be considered terrorist organizations historically, despite the U.S.'s stated goal to fight, quote unquote, fight terrorism. In many ways, the CIA has covertly fed terrorism, fed terrorist groups, and in some cases created, armed, and trained them. But that isn't seen as much part of U.S. history when it comes to terrorism, is it?
The U.S. has been supporting terrorist groups to an amazing extent. The first one was, of course, in Afghanistan, in the war against the Soviet Union. They supported the Al-Qaeda groups. In fact, the Al-Qaeda groups came out of that U.S. intervention. It's an amazing revelation, I think, that the U.S. government, with all its talk about the war on terror, has fought on the same side as Al-Qaeda and its offsprings again and again in the past 20 years or so. They were attempting their best to overthrow the government of Syria, which is the last remaining secular government in the Middle East. In fact, the U.S. has overthrown all the secular governments in the Middle East. That's why you have the ISIS group. They would never have come into being if it wasn't for the overthrow of these secular governments. It's been a great crime against humanity, what the U.S. has done in the past 20 years in the Middle East.
Can you give us an example of how the CIA has historically militarily intervened in the affairs of another country? I know there are many, but can you spell one out for us?
Well, okay, the first two attempts to overthrow governments following the Second World War were Guatemala in 1954 and Iran in 1953. In Guatemala, the CIA just created a homegrown army of disaffected Guatemala military officers and gave them all the arms and money they needed to overthrow the government, to stage a revolt and overthrow the government. And at the same time, the CIA propaganda machine was in full gear, spreading rumors which actually frightened the existing government into thinking that there was no hope at all, and they left the country.
Well, William Blum, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Okay.
Next, Andrew Bacevich helps us focus on a central question for our security policies. Do they actually keep us safe?
What U.S. policymakers failed to appreciate adequately is that, frankly, we're not wanted. I mean, we are viewed as infidels. We are viewed as outsiders, as a hostile force. And so the increased American presence triggered by 9/11 has actually increased the amount of anti-Americanism